So the title of my short little talk is Soul Talk and Software, Digital Immortality and the Resurrection of the Dead. And basically, in order to frame this, I want to talk about maybe the future of science and religion, and also some weird things that can happen when you completely embrace scientific ideas. So I guess for the main question for today is, how do you get from scientific materialism to the idea of a soul, or something like a soul? And this is a really peculiar thing that happens in a movement that I study called transhumanism. And so to just give a brief example, maybe this is actually a bit easier since we spend so much time on Zoom, but there's this prevailing feeling that the real self is something like software running on the hardware of your body, kind of like Neo being in the Matrix. And this idea dates back, at least until the 1980s. You have a book like Neuromancer, big cityscapes. You can imagine something like Tron, right? Where basically you can leave your body and be digitized and be inhabiting a completely virtual space. And so one of the questions that I'm asking, as I just said, is, well, if we embrace scientific materialism to its logical end, how is it that people get to something like the digitality, that's possible to be a fully digital person? And so to talk a little bit about what transhumanism is, basically it's a collection of social and political movements dedicated to radically changing the human condition through the use of technologies. And there's a variety of different technologies that they focus on, say biotechnology, cryonics, virtual reality, brain emulation, artificial intelligence. And for today, I'm just going to be mainly talking about virtual reality, because I think especially when it comes to more religious ideas, especially something like a soul, something that we often don't think about in the religion science conversation is that there are actually secular groups fully advocating for something for dualism today, actually often against religious critics who embrace that kind of holism of the body, and that you can't simply take a non-physical part of a person out of them and transfer it somewhere else. And I have this little graphic here to talk about, say, what they envision is you go from something like the human to the transhuman, right, to the post-human. And so there's this actually extreme embrace of the idea of evolution, of not only what is it that we are now, but what is it that we could be like in the future, and how could we deliberately take a hold of the evolutionary process and change ourselves? And so these ideas of evolution and what is it that we think about evolution, I think is a good kind of, cherry on top of some of the conversations we have from the other panelists of, well, if we fully accept and embrace these ideas and everyone were to, what is it that then people would do with something like the idea of evolution? And so one of the things that's often talked about in the transhumanist space is this thing called radical life extension, or RLE. And so if you go somewhere like Arizona, New Mexico, these places where they have lots of ample powers, people are increasingly starting to freeze themselves. And so there are services that now allow you to either freeze your body or to freeze your head. And Anya Bernstein actually did a qualitative study on Russia. And basically there's several different startups and companies looking into how to extend a person's life. And there's kind of parallel efforts that are going on of like, well, how is it that we get to the point where you might be able to be functionally immortal, right, through science? And so if we don't have that technology now, one of the ways that they think about this is, well, if we freeze you for a time, then perhaps you can live long enough such that you can get to those technologies and potentially live forever. But what's really strange, and this is not something you may not be aware of, is that even, I would say, more mainstream organizations like the IEE, the Institute for Electrical and Electronic Engineers, they have this thing called the Digital Avatar Project, which basically talks about how is it that we start to make increasingly lifelike, virtual digital persons, and what would those be like? And so these kinds of ideas that I'm talking about here are going to increasingly enter the mainstream in the next 10 to 20 years. And as people, who've been kind of confined to Zoom, again, this idea that we're really just our minds is going to be increasingly common as we kind of have a detachment from our bodies. And finally, I do just want to mention that this isn't just a secular idea, but transhumanism isn't necessarily conflicting with religion in the same way that past kind of conversations would come down this topic. And so there are actually many groups who find themselves being both religious and transhumanist. So for instance, the Christian Transhumanist Association is a place I've been able to present before. And there are other organizations all across the United States, in Russia, and kind of all over the world now that are trying to embrace, like, how do we actively take hold of evolution to control where is it, not just that we go, in society, but how we go, where is it that we'll be going as a species? So basically, to go back to my initial question of how is it that you get from scientific materials to the idea of a soul? Well, if you start to think of yourself as software, as information, right? And especially if you don't envision something like an afterlife, then the thing that becomes expedient is just the continuation of experience. And the best place to get those kinds of experiences might be in a virtual space in which you're free from disease and all these other things, and you can have a lot more control over reality. And so a lot of the attitudes that are often attributed to scientism, say of, control of the environment or whatnot, are kind of at work in this desire for something like a virtual space in which we can have complete control. So that's kind of a big information overload, but I'm happy to kind of answer questions. It's always great to talk about these things. So thank you so much for allowing me to present.